Hello and welcome to part 49 of my 3D modeling series. Let's continue with modifiers. So just a quick note, if you guys are wondering why I'm not working on my other series, it's because I want to give you a complete understanding of modifiers before I continue working on any characters. So last time I left off with the ripple modifier. Next we have, after ripple, we have select by channel. This is a specialized modifier that's used for selecting vertices. It's used with another tool, and I don't think I want to cover this one at this point. I think I'll cover this modifier later, along with the channel information tool. So I mostly want to cover the modifiers that are useful for modeling right now. So I'm going to avoid certain ones like skin, skin morph, skin wrap patch. Those are more for rigging and animating your character, so I will avoid those for now. I want to get the modifiers that are useful for modeling out of the way right now. So next we have shell. You can see in this situation I'm working on a traditional Chinese architecture with these kinds of round doorways. So what I basically have here is I have just a flat plane, and you can see right now the pivot is in the middle of the scene. It's at 0, 0, 0 on the y-axis. So what I do is I apply a symmetry modifier and then a shell modifier. Remember to apply the symmetry modifier first and then shell, because if you apply shell first and then symmetry, okay, well it's working fine in this case because the symmetry is right here, but what can happen is something like this, where there is a split in the middle. So just be aware of that. One thing you should keep in mind is that the order of your modifiers is very important, especially when you're doing rigging and animation and when you're trying to get a specific effect. The order can be very important. So in this case it doesn't matter, but usually you want to put the symmetry first and then shell. So we have symmetry, shell, and then turbo smooth with the smoothing groups option enabled. So basically with the shell modifier you have your inner amount and the outer amount. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and make these both 0. So notice what's happening here as I increase the inner amount. It's adding thickness in this direction, and then when I increase the outer amount it's adding thickness in the other direction. So if you want your object to be symmetrical on the y-axis, you'll want to go ahead and make these amounts the same. So 25 here and 25 here. And that's basically what shell does. Adds thickness to your model. It's useful in a variety of situations. Let's say for example that you're creating a cutaway view of a model. That's where you can see the inside of something. So what you do is you go ahead and delete the faces, and then these are your back faces inside. So then you just apply a shell modifier and it gives a thickness to your model. So it's useful for creating things like plates and bowls like here, and in a variety of other situations as well. So very handy. Okay, and next we have, of course, we have the skew modifier. This is a modifier just for applying this kind of skew effect. So if I put this to something like 100, and that's the amount, it's now being skewed in this direction. Then you can change the direction, the axis, so just to kind of skew your model. If you've ever used a program like Photoshop that has a skew function, this is the same thing except it's in the 3-dimensional world. Next we have the slice tool. The slice modifier, excuse me. So this is very important. This is very handy. So you notice here on this Chinese architecture, you know, I've got the wall, I've got this part, but you notice that here on the right it's very ugly and jagged, and you've got all the pieces sticking out at different amounts. So let's say I want this to be completely flat, completely even. I want it to be flush with this. I want all of these to be at the same position, the same X position, X, as this edge right here. So what do? You use the slice modifier. So I select all the objects, and then I go ahead and apply slice. I go into my sub-object mode, slice plane. Here I can actually move the slice plane, the gizmo. So we have 4 options here. The first option, refine mesh, will simply add an edge going through the position of the slice plane. The second option, split mesh, it looks the same, but what it actually does is it splits the mesh into 2 elements. So let's say that I go ahead and switch to edit poly, add edit poly. If I switch to element, I select this, you can see it's now a separate element. It looks like it's connected, but it has actually split into a separate element. So I covered this when I was teaching you guys the edit poly modifier. Okay, and remember, since we selected all these objects and applied the slice modifier, simply manipulating one object and its modifier will affect all of them. So the third option, remove top, will remove everything above the slice plane sub-object. And if I switch to remove bottom, it will remove everything at the bottom. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that my angle snap is on the same amount as usual, 22.5. I'm going to go ahead and rotate it by 90 degrees. I'm going to make sure that the remove top option is switched on. So remember that when you rotate a gizmo, it keeps its old orientation. Now what I mean by that is it says remove top, and you can see it's removing not the top but the right. But remember that this, it used to be the top, and now we've rotated to the right, but 3ds Max still thinks that this right side is actually the top. So keep that in mind. It's keeping its orientation that the right is the top and the left is the bottom. So you can see as I move it around, everything on the right, everything on the top is removed, completely flat. So I can use this to clean up all this messy geometry. And how can we get it to be even with this part? Well, there's several ways. Of course, you can always just go in here, select the vertex, go to its X position right here, and copy it. When you copy a value here, make sure you select the whole thing and any negative signs in front of it. And then just press Ctrl C to copy this value. Go back. You can click a random object that has the slice plane, the slice modifier on it. And now simply go in here and paste the X value. And there you go. It's now flush, even with these vertices right here. So we now have a very clean piece of geometry here, piece of architecture. Another thing you can do is, I'm going to go ahead and move to the right. What you can do is go into your snaps toggle, make sure vertex is on, press S to activate it, or click here. And you can see it's activated because the cyan, the light blue plus is here, which indicates that your snaps are on. I'm going to go ahead and click from here, click, hold, and move it right here. Sometimes the snap can be a little bit finicky, so sometimes you just have to play around with it. There you go. And that is how you can use snaps to quickly position your slice plane, your slice tool modifier. And now to clean it up on the other side, I'll just go ahead and select these same objects, and okay, this time it looks like I've selected an extra object. Okay. And now apply a symmetry modifier and make sure symmetry is on 0. There you go. So now I have gone from this messy model to a nice and clean model. That it's now ready to be, it's now modular. Modular means I can duplicate this a bunch of times and have it repeat. So, you know, like that. Except I would use the snaps tool to accurately position one object to the other. But this is what it means to be modular. It's a very powerful concept, which I will cover later. But the slice tool, the slice modifier, is very important, so that's one of the important uses that I use it for. Okay, next we have smooth. This is a modifier that allows you to work with smoothing groups in a modifier fashion. However, it does not have as many features as the edit poly. So the edit poly has a lot more features with the smoothing groups, so I recommend just using edit poly. Next we have spherify. It's a simple modifier for spherifying your objects. It does not work perfectly. In this case, it has given us a mess, so it's not used for every situation. A lot of these modifiers are very situational, and they will give you bad results in a bad situation if you use it incorrectly. So in this case, I used it. I gave it a value of, say, 35%, 35, and it has rounded out my steps. These are stairs that I've used to, you can step up here and go to the other side, go through the doorway. And the spherify has just kind of given it this spherical effect, just slightly, not too much to where it creates a mess, but just a little bit. I can even decrease the value to 25. So before, after, before, after. So it's useful for giving you these kinds of subtle effects. Or if you want to make an image more cartoony, more stylized, you can use the spherify as well. So if you notice that in some, in some 3D cartoons, the buildings, the props are a little bit stylized, you can use the spherify tool to just give it a little bit more roundness, a little bit more bounce, more of that cartoony effect, exaggerated cartoony effect. Simple modifier, but if you use it correctly, it can give you some nice results. Next we have the squeeze modifier. Just another simple modifier to give you this kind of squeezed effect. Just play around with it and see what you can get. You can see in this case it has given me this kind of effect. So before, after, before, after. So it's very specialized, but it can kind of give you some unexpected results and maybe jumpstart your imagination and give you some new interesting shapes to work with. So you can take a boring shape and turn it into something a bit more interesting, and maybe play around with the gizmo and the center settings to see what you can get. This almost looks like a stylized skyscraper of some sort. So you can use this to quickly turn a boring shape into something more interesting. Next we have STL check. So if you're doing something like 3D printing, you'll want what is called an airtight mesh. This basically means that there are no holes. It's a single solid volume and there are no holes. So as you're modeling, maybe working with a sculpting program, you might get some holes here. And if you have a very complex model, it's not as easy to find the holes as it is here. So what you would do is you would go ahead and apply STL check, These are the errors that you can check for: open edges, double face, spike, multiple edge, or all of the above, everything. This is also useful if you're working on a video game model. And you know, video game models are very picky about the geometry, so you don't want anything like double faces or open edges there. So click right here where it says check, and now she goes ahead and selects that geometry. If I then put on the other poly modifier and go to my edge mode, I have to, let's see, here in the selections I can go ahead and click on select edges, and now when I go into edit poly edge mode, those edges that the STL check modifier found are visible right here, are selected for me. So STL check, a good modifier to quickly check for holes and other errors in your geometry. Next we have stretch, a simple modifier for stretching and squashing your model. Very simple. It's similar to the third scale option right here. It does something similar, except it's a modifier, so you can animate it. Okay, next we have subdivide. This simply goes, and the lower the number here, the more it will subdivide your model. Add these triangles there. Now normally this is not very useful, and be aware, if you set the size to too low, it might use up all your memory and cause your program to crash. So with some of these modifiers, be careful about what number you set it to, because it might cause Max to do so many calculations that it will crash the program. But what this allows you to do is it allows you to see what your model will look like when it's triangulated. So you might know that when you export your model, your mesh to a game engine, it will automatically triangulate all the faces. And you can kind of see what that looks like using the subdivide modifier. Simply increase the size to something large like 500, and you can see what your model will look like when it's been triangulated. So it's useful when you're working on game resolution meshes. Next we have surface deform. This is another specialized modifier that I will cover at a later time. Alright, next we have the symmetry. Of course, symmetry is one of my favorite modifiers. It's very useful for quickly speeding up your workflow. So I have a box here, and let me go ahead and symmetrify the box simply by adding edges here. This will make it much easier to apply symmetry modifier. So here I have a corner of a box, and I can use symmetry X. I can apply symmetry is Y. Sometimes you have to flip it because it has a default orientation. And I can have symmetry Z. And the Z, remember that when you apply symmetry modifier, it will use the pivot of your object. So in this case, the pivot of this box is right here at the bottom. So when I apply symmetry, it will use that pivot by default. So you'll sometimes have to manually change the actual location of the symmetry. And you can use the snap tool, vertex, to do that. Once again, sometimes the snap tool is a little bit finicky, so sometimes you have to change the view to get it working properly. So now all I have to do is modify this one corner, and the symmetry modifier will do the rest. very convenient for speeding up your workflow, and it has some other uses as well. I will cover the symmetry modifier and what you can do with it in greater detail, or more about the theory and the workflow of how you can use the symmetry modifier to quickly get a variety of ornaments and decorative geometry. But for now, just know that you can use symmetry to speed up your workflow. And one thing you should keep in mind is when you use the bevel feature, and if I bevel in this direction, you can see that it goes inside. So if I delete this, the symmetry modifier will give me these kind of bad results. So one thing I can do is when I bevel, I keep the outline amount at 0 and just increase the height, and then I can use the scale tool to get me the bevel that I want. And then I can just go ahead and use the planar tools here, Z and Y, 2 or X in this case, to even things out. Thank you for watching and take care.